Nina Simone spent her entire life singing about Black identity, freedom, and belonging, but the DNA evidence that surfaced after her death revealed an ancestry so specific, so historically charged, and so precisely traceable that it reframes everything she stood for. She did not just carry those themes in her voice, she carried them in her blood. So what exactly did that DNA reveal? And why does it change the way we understand the woman behind the music? Before we dive in, comment where you are watching from and click subscribe. She was born Eunice Kathleen Wayman in Tryon, North Carolina in 1933. The sixth of 8 children raised in a household shaped by Methodist faith and financial hardship. Her mother was a preacher. Her father repaired things for a living. The family had very little, but Eunice had something that set her apart from the earliest age. She could play the piano by ear before she had received a single formal lesson. By her early teens, she was studying classical piano seriously, driven by a singular ambition to become the first Black classical pianist to perform at Carnegie Hall. She applied to the Curtis Institute of Music in Philadelphia, one of the most prestigious conservatories in the world. They rejected her. Simone believed for the rest of her life that the rejection was racial. Curtis never confirmed it, but the wound never closed, and what grew in its place was something far more confrontational than a concert career. She began performing in clubs to pay for continued lessons, took the stage name Nina Simone to hide the work from her mother, and found that audiences responded to something in her that conservatories had no framework to measure. She became the high priestess of soul, not by abandoning classical discipline, but by fusing it with blues, jazz, gospel, and a political directness that made her impossible to ignore. Mississippi Goddamn, released in 1964 following the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, was not a protest song in the polite tradition. It was fury, precise and unsparing. To Be Young, Gifted, and Black became an anthem for a generation. She aligned herself with the more militant edges of the civil rights movement and made clear that her music was not entertainment. It was confrontation. Here was a woman who built her entire public identity around the question of what it meant to be Black in America. She carried that question into every performance, every interview, every act of deliberate refusal to make herself palatable. Before the science could speak, her life had already asked the question. The DNA simply answered it in a language she never anticipated. To understand what the DNA revealed, it helps to understand what DNA testing can and cannot do, particularly for African Americans, whose genealogical records were systematically destroyed by the institution of slavery. Modern ancestry testing works through several distinct methods. Autosomal DNA captures a broad ethnic percentage picture, drawing from both maternal and paternal lines across multiple generations. Mitochondrial DNA, passed exclusively from mother to child and unchanged across generations, traces the direct maternal line back hundreds or even thousands of years. Y chromosome DNA does the same for the direct paternal line, but only in male descendants. Together, these tools can reach back through centuries of silence where documents cannot go. For African Americans, that silence is not metaphorical. The transatlantic slave trade erased names, languages, family structures, and ethnic identities on an industrial scale. Most African Americans cannot trace their family tree beyond 3 or 4 generations using documentary records alone. After that, the paper trail ends, replaced by plantation ledgers that recorded people as property rather than persons, and often not at all. DNA fills that gap, but not perfectly. The science can identify ethnic and geographic origin with considerable precision. It can name the regions of Africa, the population groups, the migration patterns embedded in a person's genetic code. What it cannot do is name individuals. It cannot tell you who your ancestor was, only where they came from. The African Ancestry Project, founded specifically to help people of African descent trace their lineage, uses a reference database of over 30,000 indigenous African samples to match DNA profiles to specific present-day African ethnic groups and countries of origin. The precision this allows is genuinely different from consumer ancestry estimates. It does not return a broad regional percentage. It returns a specific population match. Nina Simone's ancestry research drew on exactly this kind of targeted lineage analysis. The methodology was designed to cut through centuries of erasure. What it found in her maternal line was something researchers described as unusually precise and unusually historically significant. The question was no longer whether answers existed. The question was whether those answers, once revealed, would change anything. The first major result came from Nina Simone's maternal line, and it was specific in a way that broader consumer ancestry tests rarely deliver. Her direct maternal lineage traced to the Yoruba people of West Africa, not West Africa generally, not a regional estimate. The Yoruba specifically, one of the largest and most historically consequential ethnic groups on the African continent, centered in what is today southwestern Nigeria and the Republic of Benin, with cultural reach extending across the Gulf of Guinea and deep into the diaspora. The Yoruba were not a scattered or marginal population. At the height of their civilization, they built some of the most sophisticated urban centers in sub-Saharan Africa. The city of Ile-Ife was considered the spiritual origin of the Yoruba world. Ibadan and Oyo were political and military powers, with complex governance structures, trade networks, and artistic traditions that rivaled anything contemporaneous in the region. Yoruba, religious thought, embodied in the IFA tradition, was a system of philosophy, divination, and ethical teaching sophisticated enough that it would survive the Atlantic crossing and take root in Brazil, Cuba, Trinidad, and Haiti, where it became Candomblé, Santeria, and Vodou. That survival was not accidental. It was the result of a people whose cultural memory was strong enough to persist even under the total suppression of slavery. The Yoruba were among the most heavily deported groups in the transatlantic slave trade, particularly through the Bight of Benin, the stretch of West African coastline that European traders simply called the Slave Coast. Millions passed through those ports. Many of them carried Yoruba language, Yoruba faith, and Yoruba identity into bondage. What the DNA result meant was that Nina Simone's maternal ancestors were among them, not metaphorically, genetically. The match was precise enough to name the people, the region, and the cultural tradition. For a woman who spent decades trying to locate herself, who moved to Liberia searching for an Africa she felt was hers, the result carried a weight that went well beyond genealogy. The science had found what she had spent a lifetime reaching for. But it had also opened a door that led somewhere much darker. The Yoruba identification answered where Nina Simone's maternal line originated. It did not answer how that line traveled from southwestern Nigeria to the foothills of western North Carolina. That journey required a different kind of reckoning. The transatlantic slave trade moved people through specific corridors. The Bight of Benin, the coastline running roughly from modern-day Ghana to Nigeria, was the primary departure point for enslaved Yoruba people. European and American slave traders operated through a network of coastal forts and holding stations, purchasing or capturing people and loading them onto ships bound for the Americas. The crossing itself, the Middle Passage, lasted weeks. Those who survived arrived not as individuals with names and histories, but as cargo, assigned numbers, and distributed according to the demands of colonial labor markets. The American South received a significant portion of these deportations. South Carolina and Georgia were primary landing points, with distribution networks that moved enslaved people further inland through sale and inheritance. North Carolina, sitting between these coastal hubs and the Appalachian interior, absorbed a steady population of enslaved people across the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The Yoruba were among them, their ethnic identity stripped at the point of sale, their language suppressed, their names replaced. The generational math matters here. Nina Simone was born in 1933. Her maternal great-great-grandparents would have been born in the mid to late 1800s. placing them either in the final decades of American slavery or in its immediate aftermath. Her Yoruba ancestors were not remote. They were recent, separated from her by only a handful of generations, close enough that the cultural traces of their origin had not fully disappeared even when the explicit knowledge of it had. Tryon, North Carolina, the small Appalachian foothills town where she was born, sits in a region shaped entirely by this history of forced migration, cultural erasure, and survival. The community her family belonged to was built by people whose genealogical roots had been deliberately severed. The DNA had now restored one of those roots, but the full picture of Nina Simone's ancestry was not finished. There were other threads, and not all of them pointed to Africa. The ancestry profile did not stop at West Africa. Among the results was a significant percentage of European DNA, and in the context of Nina Simone's life and the history her family carried, that finding demanded more than a percentage. It demanded an explanation. The presence of European ancestry in African American DNA profiles is statistically common. Research into African American genetics has consistently shown an average European admixture of approximately 24%, a figure that reflects not voluntary intermarriage, but the systematic sexual exploitation of enslaved women across generations of American slavery. The DNA does not record consent, it records contact. And in the context of slavery, contact between enslaved black women and white men was overwhelmingly a record of coercion, abuse, and the total legal powerlessness of the women involved. Nina Simone understood this history intimately, not as abstraction, but as inheritance. She spoke openly about the violence embedded in Black American life, about the layers of dehumanization that slavery and its aftermath had constructed. What the DNA now confirmed was that her own family line bore the biological record of exactly that violence. The European percentage in her profile was not a complication of her identity. It was a documentation of what had been done to her ancestors. The weight of that lands differently when placed against the arc of her career. Here was a woman rejected by European classical institutions who then spent decades confronting white supremacy through her music, her politics, and her refusal to accommodate a white audience's comfort. And running through her DNA was the evidence that white supremacy had already reached into her family line, generations before she was born, in the most intimate and violating way possible. She did not need the science to know this. Every African American with that kind of ancestry profile carries the same history. But the confirmation matters because it refuses euphemism. It names what happened rather than softening it into a narrative of cultural blending or mixed heritage. The European thread in Nina Simone's DNA was not a complication. It was a continuation of the same story the Yoruba identification had already begun to tell. And the story was not finished yet. The European ancestry was not the final thread. The DNA results contained a third component, smaller in percentage but significant in what it represented historically and in what it said about the specific geography of Nina Simone's origins. The profile included a measurable Indigenous American ancestry signal. This finding was not anomalous. Among African Americans with roots in the American South, and particularly those from the Carolinas, indigenous ancestry appears with notable frequency in genealogical DNA research. The reasons are historical and geographic, rooted in the specific landscape of colonial and antebellum America. Western North Carolina, the region where Nina Simone was born and where her family had lived for generations, sat within the traditional territory of the Cherokee Nation. Before removal, before the Trail of Tears forcibly displaced tens of thousands of Cherokee people westward beginning in 1838, the Cherokee had lived across the southern Appalachian highlands for centuries. Some remained after removal, sheltering in the mountains, their descendants becoming the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. Others had already formed connections with the Black communities developing in the same region, through proximity, through shared marginalization, and in some cases through intermarriage across generations. The Catawba Nation also held a significant presence in the Carolina Piedmont region. Their population had been drastically reduced by disease, conflict, and displacement across the 18th century, but their descendants remained embedded in the region's communities, including its black communities, in ways that documentary records rarely captured, but that DNA now confirms with regularity. What the indigenous signal in Nina Simone's profile represented was not a footnote. It was another layer of the same American story. 3 populations, African, European, and indigenous, each brought into contact through displacement, enslavement, and colonial violence, their histories converging in a single family line in the Carolina foothills. Nina Simone's DNA was not unusual in this structure. It was, in many ways, a precise reflection of what American history actually produced, but the accumulation of these findings, layer by layer, was now pointing toward a question the science could raise but not fully answer. Some of what her ancestry contained was nameable, some of it was not. This was an unanswered history. Nina Simone spent the last decades of her life in motion. She left the United States in the early 1970s, first for Barbados, then for Liberia, then for a series of European cities that included Paris, the Netherlands, and finally Carry-le-Rouet in the south of France, where she died in 2003. The departures were not accidental, they were declaration. She spoke about America with the specific exhaustion of someone who had fought for recognition within a system designed to withhold it. She described freedom not as something she expected to find in the United States, but as something she was willing to cross an ocean to locate. Her move to Liberia in particular was weighted with meaning. Liberia had been established in part as a destination for freed American slaves returning to Africa. For Simone, it represented something closer to a homecoming than a relocation. The DNA results reframed that instinct in a precise way. She was not reaching toward a generalized Africa. Her maternal line ran directly to Yoruba, West Africa, to the same region her ancestors had been taken from, through the same ports her ancestors had been shipped through. The continent she was moving toward was, in a genealogical sense, the continent that had been taken from her family. The longing was not romantic, it was ancestral. Her music carried this weight long before any science confirmed it. The spiritual intensity of her performances, the specific quality of her engagement with African and diasporic musical traditions, the religious gravity she brought to secular material, all of it drew from a cultural inheritance that the DNA now traces to a specific origin. Yoruba, religious and musical tradition, has a particular relationship with performance as a spiritual act. Nina Simone's work, across every genre she touched, operated in exactly that register. She spent her life trying to locate herself in a country that had worked systematically to make that location impossible. The DNA did not give her something new. It confirmed what her instincts had already told her. She had been reaching in the right direction all along. She simply had not had the scientific language to name what she already knew. The DNA answered the question of where Nina Simone came from. It could not answer the question that sits beneath that one. Mitochondrial DNA traces a direct maternal line with precision. It can identify a population, a region, a cultural group. What it cannot do is name a person. The Yoruba woman who was taken through the Bight of Benin, loaded onto a ship, and delivered into slavery in the American South had a name. She had a language, a family, a set of obligations and relationships within her community. The DNA preserves her genetic signature across centuries. It does not preserve anything else. The same is true of every link in the chain. The enslaved woman in the Carolinas, whose European ancestry documents the violence done to her, had a name. The indigenous ancestor whose presence survives only as a percentage in a modern DNA profile had a name. None of those names are recoverable. Slavery did not simply separate people from their homelands. It separated them from their own histories. And that separation was not accidental. It was the point. This is what makes Nina Simone's ancestry profile something more than a biographical footnote. Her DNA is, in its structure, a document of American history. The Yoruba identification names the origin. The European percentage names the mechanism of violation. The indigenous signal names the specific geography of dispossession. Together they tell a story that the official record was designed to suppress. She sang about all of it without ever having access to this level of specificity. Mississippi Goddamn was written without a DNA report. To Be Young, Gifted and Black was written without a genealogical study. She arrived at the truth through a different kind of evidence, the evidence of lived experience, of inherited memory, of a fury that had been passed down through generations as reliably as any genetic marker. The science confirmed what the music had already said. Her ancestry was not a mystery waiting to be solved. It was a history waiting to be named. The DNA named it. What remains unnamed are the people themselves, and no technology we currently possess can return them to us. Nina Simone sang about freedom, identity, and the weight of a history her people were never permitted to document. The DNA confirmed what her music had always carried, a Yoruba origin, precise and traceable, shaped by one of the most violent forced migrations in human history. The individuals in that chain, the woman taken from West Africa, the ancestor whose suffering the European percentage records, remain beyond what science can restore. Some of what history took cannot be returned. They can only be named.